Welcome back to the Sigma Evolution channel, where today we examine how the Quizma handles manipulation, narrative control, narcissistic style attacks, psychological pressure, and the people who make one critical mistake before the contest has even begun. They underestimate him, sometimes badly. They mistake patience for passivity, politeness for weakness, curiosity for confusion, flexibility for compliance, and silence for an inability to respond. The Quizma rarely corrects that misunderstanding immediately. In fact, there is a part of him that almost welcomes it, not because he enjoys conflict, and certainly not because he enters rooms looking for people to defeat. He would much rather spend his energy building, learning, creating, or simply enjoying his peace. But when someone insists on turning an ordinary interaction into a psychological chess match, the Quizma does not panic when the board appears. He pulls up a chair. His first advantage is shrewdness. He watches before he reacts. A manipulator often depends on emotional speed. Get someone angry quickly enough and they stop thinking clearly. Make them feel guilty quickly enough and they may agree to something before examining the premise. Embarrass them in public and they may defend themselves so aggressively that the reaction becomes more memorable than the original offense. The Quizma understands this, so he slows everything down. He listens. He notices when the facts begin moving. He notices when a simple disagreement suddenly becomes an attack on his character. He notices when a question is answered with another accusation. He notices when the other person keeps changing the subject just before accountability reaches their doorstep. And rather than charging forward, he becomes almost welcoming. Go ahead. Finish. Tell me what you mean. That calm invitation can be deeply uncomfortable to someone expecting panic, because the Quizma is not merely listening to the argument. He is studying its construction. Where is the pressure point? What assumption is being smuggled into the sentence? What emotional response is this person trying to produce? What would they need him to believe in order for the manipulation to work? Then comes the question. Usually one. What exactly are you saying happened? Which part of what I said are you responding to? Are we still discussing the original issue? A manipulator often thrives in fog. The Quizma does not wrestle with fog. He opens the curtains. This is where savoir-faire becomes important. He understands that not every manipulation should be confronted like a courtroom showdown. Sometimes subtlety works better. He may nod. He may smile. He may allow the other person to believe they are advancing. He can appear tractable because he genuinely is flexible in matters that do not violate his judgment. That distinction matters. Tractability is not surrender. It is controlled adaptability. He can give ground where the ground has no strategic value. He can say, I understand why you might feel that way. He can acknowledge frustration. He can concede a minor point. But he quietly keeps hold of the central fact. This is where people often miscalculate him. They believe they have won because he did not resist theatrically. The Quizma does not need theater. He is not trying to look powerful. He is trying to remain accurate. And somewhere inside him, there is a quiet satisfaction when the tactic begins reversing itself. Not malicious pleasure. More like watching a complicated knot loosen because someone finally pulled the correct thread. A person attempts guilt. He asks for clarity. They attempt confusion. He restores sequence. They attempt intimidation. He lowers his voice. They attempt to make him defend an accusation he never accepted. He examines the premise instead. If you cared, you would do this. Why must caring require obedience? Everyone thinks you are the problem. Who exactly is everyone? You are too sensitive. Does that change what happened? The Quizma does not attack every sentence. He removes its hidden foundation. And once that foundation disappears, the tactic often collapses under its own weight. This is where his charisma helps. He can remain socially composed while the manipulation becomes increasingly obvious. He does not need to humiliate the other person. He does not need the audience chanting his name. He simply stays centered long enough for contrast to become visible. One person grows louder. The other becomes clearer. One person rewrites. The other returns to fact. One person performs. The other observes. And that is the first secret of how the Quizma dismantles manipulation. He rarely begins by fighting the opponent. He lets the opponent introduce themselves. He reverses the mechanism. The real test comes when manipulation stops being an isolated tactic and becomes a pattern. Praise followed by withdrawal. Affection followed by punishment. Provocation followed by denial. Public charm followed by private contempt. Promises that somehow become different promises once they are remembered aloud. The Quizma studies repetition. He does not need a diagnosis. He does not need to spend hours deciding whether someone fits a psychological label. He is more interested in behavior. What happens every time I disagree? What happens when I set a boundary? What happens when this person cannot control the outcome? Do they seek understanding, or do they seek surrender? This is where his cleverness becomes particularly effective. The manipulator expects reaction. The Quizma begins collecting pattern. They expect him to defend himself emotionally. He begins organizing facts. They expect him to argue about intent. He examines consequences. They expect him to become lost in the story. He returns to chronology. What happened first? What did you say next? What changed after that? Sequence is a surprisingly powerful weapon against narrative manipulation because convenient stories often depend on rearranging events. The Quizma puts the furniture back where it was. Then he waits. This is where his deftness becomes almost elegant. He does not rush to expose every contradiction the moment he hears it. Sometimes he lets one version sit. Then another. Then another. The other person assumes he missed the inconsistency. He did not. He is allowing the pattern to become complete. There is a peculiar satisfaction in this for the Quizma, because he does not have to manufacture the opponent's collapse. He simply stops interrupting it. The contradictions begin stacking themselves. One statement weakens another. A denial conflicts with yesterday's certainty. A revised story contradicts the original accusation. The Quizma may not even need to say much. Sometimes people dismantle their own position when given enough uninterrupted room. Gravity does not need applause. His charm becomes especially useful here. Charm, in the Quizma's world, is not flotation or performance. It is social control without aggression. He can remain pleasant while saying no. He can smile while refusing a false premise. He can acknowledge another person's feelings without accepting their conclusion. I understand that upset you. That is empathy. I still disagree with your interpretation. That is judgment. Manipulation often tries to fuse the two. If you acknowledge their pain, you must accept their accusation. If you reject their accusation, you must not care about their pain. The Quizma refuses that binary. He looks for the third door. He may apologize for tone while defending the decision. He may understand the emotion while rejecting the demand. He may care deeply and still leave. He may forgive someone and still reduce their access. That is where tractability becomes strength. He bends where bending is intelligent. He does not bend where bending would require self-betrayal. This is particularly effective against narcissistic-style tactics such as blame shifting, baiting, triangulation, devaluation, grandiosity, or attempts to control how others perceive the conflict. The Quizma does not try to out-manipulate the manipulator. That would make him another player in the same dirty game. He does something more disciplined. He reduces fuel. Less emotional reaction. Less explanation. Less private information. Less access to the parts of himself that have already been mishandled. He becomes courteous but difficult to penetrate. Present but increasingly unavailable for exploitation. And here comes the reversal. The person who expected to control his attention discovers that their own behavior is now under observation. The accusation that was supposed to destabilize him becomes evidence. The pressure that was supposed to make him comply becomes information. The attempt to provoke him becomes a demonstration of the tactic itself. The Quizma almost seems to welcome each move because every move teaches him something. Not because he wanted the conflict. Because once the conflict arrived, he decided it would not be wasted. That is the necessity behind his response. He does not dismantle people for sport. He dismantles tactics because leaving them intact would mean surrendering control of his own reality. If someone brings a psychological tool into the room and aims it at him, he studies the tool. Then he quietly takes away its usefulness. No rage. No revenge speech. No dramatic promise that they will regret underestimating him. Usually, they discover that on their own. He doesn't need the final word. Eventually, manipulation reaches its most ambitious stage. If the person cannot control your decision, they may try to control the story about your decision. Now the battlefield becomes reputation. Suddenly, the question is no longer what happened. It is who gets to define what happened. The Quizma recognizes the trap immediately. The obvious impulse is to defend himself everywhere. Correct every rumor. Answer every accusation. Explain every conversation. Chase every version of the story through every social circle. He refuses. Because if someone can force him to spend all his energy disproving their version of him, they still control him. He simply moved from their conversation into their orbit. So he becomes selective. He corrects what matters. He documents what matters. He speaks where consequences matter. Everything else is evaluated according to value. This can confuse people who expect him to fight for every inch. But the Quizma understands something important. You do not defend a castle by chasing every bird that flies over the wall. Sometimes the most powerful defense is remaining where you are. Consistency becomes his answer. If someone claims he is unstable, he remains measured. If they claim he is dishonest, he keeps records. If they claim his boundary is cruelty, he maintains it without cruelty. If they bait him hoping for an explosive reaction, he denies them the photograph. This is not passivity. It is disciplined refusal. And here again comes that quiet satisfaction. The opponent wants noise. He gives them silence. They want confusion. He asks for sequence. They want guilt. He asks for logic. They want desperation. He gives them patience. They want him trapped inside their narrative. He simply walks outside it. That is often the moment the dynamic changes completely. The manipulator begins working harder than the Quizma. More accusations. More explanations. More attempts to provoke. More contradictions. More urgency. The Quizma notices. And he almost welcomes the effort now because each new tactic reveals how dependent the entire strategy was on his participation. The machine only worked while he supplied electricity. So he unplugs it. That is the essence of his self-command. He knows when to confront, when to clarify, when to joke, when charm can lower the temperature, when a precise sentence can restore reality, and when silence is the only answer that cannot be twisted. Imagine him sitting across from someone determined to control the exchange. They interrupt. He lets them finish. They accuse. He asks for specifics. They exaggerate. He returns to sequence. They rewrite the story. He remembers the original. They become louder. He becomes calmer. They accuse him of avoiding the conversation. He notices that the conversation stopped being a conversation several minutes ago. Then he says, "This is no longer productive." That is not surrender. It is the moment he closes the casino. No more bets. No more chips. No more game. And this is where people often misunderstand the Quizma's satisfaction. He does not enjoy hurting people. He does not need to watch an opponent collapse. His satisfaction comes from recovering order, from watching confusion become clarity, from seeing a tactic that was designed to control him lose its effect, from realizing that someone entered the room expecting to manipulate a passive target and instead discovered a man quietly examining the mechanism. It is not vengeance. It is restoration. The Quizma does not seek domination. He seeks sovereignty. And sovereignty means no one else gets automatic control over his interpretation, emotions, boundaries, or decisions. He knows he can still be deceived. He knows he has blind spots. He knows intelligence is not immunity. That humility matters. The Quizma's real advantage is correction. When evidence changes, he changes his conclusion. When trust is broken, he changes access. When a pattern becomes undeniable, he stops negotiating with the exception. And once he recognizes the mechanism, he rarely allows the same mechanism to work twice. That is why people who underestimate him often experience the same strange reversal. They believe they are studying his weaknesses. Meanwhile, he is learning their methods. They believe they are controlling the frame. Meanwhile, he is deciding whether the frame deserves his attention. They believe they are setting the trap. Meanwhile, he is noticing where the wire runs. Then comes the final irony. The person trying hardest to control him eventually discovers that the Quizma was never interested in controlling them back. He simply wanted his peace returned. And once he has it, he leaves them with something manipulation hates more than defeat: irrelevance. So how does the Quizma handle manipulation? He does not rush to fight it. He welcomes the information. His shrewdness notices the pattern. His cleverness uncovers the hidden premise. His savoir-faire keeps him socially composed. His deftness separates emotion from fact. His tractability allows flexibility without surrender. His charisma keeps pressure from defining the atmosphere. And his charm allows him to dismantle a tactic without becoming ugly in the process. Most importantly, he understands that not every opponent needs to be crushed. Some simply need to be understood. Because once the Quizma understands the mechanism loses much of its power. That is where his quiet satisfaction comes from. Someone underestimated him. They believed the silence meant weakness. They believed the courtesy meant compliance. They believed the flexibility meant they could move him anywhere they wanted. Then slowly, almost politely, every tactic begins returning to sender. Not because the Quizma entered looking for war. Because someone brought war into his peace and expected him not to notice. That was the miscalculation. So tell us in the comments, which manipulation tactic becomes most obvious once you finally recognize the pattern? And subscribe to the Sigma Evolution channel so you do not miss the next episode. Because the Quizma does not spend his life searching for opponents. But when someone insists on becoming one, they may discover something rather inconvenient. He was paying attention long before they realized they were being studied.